have you. Professor Nicolas van der Waal, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. How is your day going so far?
Very, very well. Very well.
That is great. That is great. I'm happy to have you on this talk show, and you are very much welcome. Before we get to start to talk about the book, this was an interesting and outstanding publication, and I believe it's worth discussing on platforms like this. Before we get to start, I have been looking at your CV, and I've noticed that you've had a profound academic and professional career. It says here that before joining Cornell, you taught at Michigan State University and worked at the World Bank and the United Nations Development Program. And it also says that at Cornell, you have directed the MEC Center for International Studies. Can you just briefly take us through this journey and how it was for you? And also tell us briefly the work that you did with these organizations.
Well, you know, I got interested in international development issues while I was in college. And after a master's at the London School of Economics, I had the chance to work for the United Nations Development Program in Tunisia as a junior professional officer, and I spent 3 years there and enjoyed it enormously, but felt I needed to go back to school. So I did a PhD in public policy. Not sure whether I wanted to be an academic or work in public policy. And when I finished my PhD, which included 2 years of working as a consultant at the World Bank, I worked at Michigan State University as an assistant professor, having decided that I thought I did want to become an academic. But I've always been very interested in public policy issues and continue to be so. I think that for an academic political scientist, the public policy world is kind of a reality check, you know, and I've always wanted my work to be kind of relevant outside of academia. So that's, and then I since 2004, I've been at Cornell University, and I'm very happy here. And you know, that's about all I can say. But that it kind of explains the trajectory.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction. I noticed and I see that you've had a profound background career, a background and professional academic career. So now looking at this book, African Economies and the Politics of Permanent Crisis. It's a book that has been there for quite some time. Yeah. It's a book that we've been also using here for our African Studies program, and we've been recommending it for our students for classes that we've been taking and so forth. And I believe it has also been used in different other universities for studies. It has been there for quite some time. And I can see that there is an online publication of it that was recently done by Cambridge University Press as of June 2012. And I believe it is worthy to have a discussion of it because, quote unquote, if we are to look at this generation of online, this online generation, would really want to hear a talk about this book. So now, what would you consider to be the core ideas of this book, or perhaps what you consider to be the central argument of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is an old book, and you know, most of the research for it and the writing of it was in the late 90s. It comes out in 2001. and that is a long time ago. So I'm tickled to death that anybody's still interested in such an old book. But I do think one has to situate oneself in the sort of academic and policy debates of the late 90s to see where I'm coming from. I actually sat down this morning and reread parts of it to try to remember at least to inspire what I was going to try to tell you. I think the main idea is that it's kind of to me it's a revisionist account. As I was living through the 90s and doing field work in Africa and researching this book, I was always struck by the fact that both on the left ideologically and on the right, structural adjustment reforms and the intervention of the World Bank and the IMF in Africa was viewed as, a kind of revolutionary, anti-status quo set of reforms. And my revisionist argument is basically that the structural adjustment was designed to preserve the status quo and to preserve the sort of post-colonial, elites in power that had been in power since independence, and typically quite reliant on foreign aid. And I just thought a lot of the debates about structural adjustment were wrong because, the economic crisis that had hit Africa was devastating for Africa, but the donors funneling money to governments was pro-status quo in intent. It was designed to make whatever changes African leaders needed to make on the economic front more sustainable, more palatable politically, to a large extent, it was successful because, we still see there's still a number of leaders in power today in Africa who were in power in 1979, or at least in the 80s, and as recently as a decade ago, a lot of those leaders were still in power, right? A lot of those governments were still in power. So in that sense, I did want to argue that to show that this was not a kind of anti-status quo revolutionary, really discontinuous program on the part of the international donors. Now, just to add something, there was a big literature at the time and a big academic interest with the politics of economic reform, and I wanted to contribute to the academic debates about the nature of the politics during a reform era, and that was a more academic concern to contribute to that growing literature.
Oh, that is great. That is wonderful. I had to mention that the book has been there for quite some time, but many of the ideas that you raise in many of these chapters are issues that still currently affect the continent. We've got many countries that are trapped within the problems of neo-patrimonialism, the problems of foreign aid, of dealing with foreign aid and so forth. And this is why I believe it's a critical book that raises critical themes that are critical to study at this point in time. So can you tell us something about your experiences with research in the process of researching this book? What were your sources for the manuscript, and how did they shape the argument that you take?
So I had my doctoral dissertation was on the politics of economic reform in Cameroon, mm-hmm. and I had done a fair amount of field work in Cameroon as a PhD student, and I basically I then got sidelined with different other projects and came back. 7-8 years after my dissertation, still wanting to to turn the dissertation into a book, but a broader book that was not just on Cameroon. And so through a lot of the 90s, I was doing different projects that were taking me to do a fair amount of field work in the region. I must have done, at least some field work in about a dozen African countries. And I always, it might have been, one, I was working at the World Bank or for completely different projects, but I always had in mind this project on structural adjustment. And so a lot of the research was through field work in a number of countries, basically during the 90s. Now that interviewing people in Washington, in Paris and London, and then a lot of the sort of burgeoning, gray literature coming out of the donors. This was before you could just go to the internet and download everything you wanted to. That was the other main source of literature. It's a qualitative book. There's an argument that runs through it that's informed, but the data is basically qualitative data. There's no, there's some descriptive statistics, but there's no regression or there's no survey. Or I did a lot of elite interviews. I mean, I must have interviewed over 100 African decision makers in these 12 countries on these issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's huge. That's pretty much a rigorous work that you did. Your book demonstrates how Western donors and lenders, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, have systematically, if unwittingly, undermined the institutional capacity of African states to manage reform and growth. Can you briefly talk about the politics of this trajectory? How deliberate are these loan advancement and debt inducement?
Well, I don't know that the IMF and the bank. I think until the debt crisis begins in the early 80s, right? The Mexico defaults on its debt in August 82, and that's the official beginning of the debt crisis. Until then, I don't think the bank and the fund, I think they thought that the constant lending of money was sustainable. And then after that, I think they went in to lend more, in part to protect previous lending, right? So a lot of the lending was designed to pay back old loans so that officially African governments didn't default or were servicing them, right? And there was no private sector lending whatsoever. We tend to forget that now, that the lending by the IMF and the bank was a substitute to the private sector, unlike, say, in Latin America, where there was a ton of private sector lending, right? In Africa, other than a handful of oil producers, there was virtually no private sector lending. And so, the bank and the fund were under enormous pressure, including from African governments, to continue lending. And so they did. I think at some point they realized that it had become unsustainable. And then they were in a way, very happy to see the anti-debt crisis, social movements emerged like Jubilee, because that created pressure for the funders of the bank and the fund to provide more money to the fund and the bank to start doing debt forgiveness. And that leads to the end of the debt crisis by, 2000, the early 2000s. When debt stops being nearly as big an issue as it was when I was writing. Mm-hmm. I don't know, does that answer your question? I mean, I think, the fund in particular, which had been set up to manage the dollar system, and the system of fixed exchange rates, was looking for a new mission. and being a kind of instrument of international stabilization, a fund realized that was a pretty good job for it to undertake, in the era of flexible exchange rates, and so it liked that it moved into this new role for itself, right? For the bank, I think it was a bit different, because in Africa, at least, it was mostly IDA funding, which is very, very long, grace period, and created a debt burden, but not a ton of servicing, right? So I don't. I mean, we talk now about how a lot of Chinese lending is very quickly leading to a debt crisis.
Yeah.
And some people are accusing China of having engaged in a form of debt entrapment. I don't think, I mean, whatever, even if that's, I have no idea what the Chinese intentions were. I can't speak to them, but I don't think there was that kind of intent. I do think the bank and the fund enjoyed having the intention of African governments, and enjoyed being able to, did not mind the power that it came to have in the Africa region, right? From these very, very aid-dependent countries. But I don't think it sought to get there, And by the way, since then, both the IMF and in particular the bank have become much less important lenders in the region.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Well, you also premise this book on a certain time frame, that is to say, from 1979 up to 1999. What can you say about this time? Like, what really sparked your interest about this time? I know it's probably the time when these countries were receiving these monies, and a lot was happening with regards to how they were managed and so forth. But what else can we say about this time that was of fundamental importance?
So to be perfectly honest, adding that comma 1979 to 1999 at the end of the title was done very late in the day. And it was as I was finishing the manuscript, the first draft that I submitted to the publishers, I want to say about 98, 99, maybe, I became conscious of the fact that things were changing in Africa. And in particular, after 95, you do have the return of economic growth, right? You have the emergence of the first wave of real debt relief. And I suddenly got, I called it the permanent crisis and all that, but it suddenly occurred to me that maybe the crisis was coming to an end, and maybe some more successful economies would emerge. I think that was right. I had the right instincts, right? Because by certainly 90, the return of economic growth, Christmas 94, the franc zone devalues, the way overvalued CFA franc, and then countries like Ghana, Kenya start growing again appreciably in 95, 96. Commodity prices start to go back up, and so on. And so I did want to say, okay, I'm going to study a specific time in history, and if there's another book to be written, I'll date that differently. But I was suddenly sensing that things were starting to change in the region, and I think they did.
Yeah, sure thing. Some changes were witnessed beginning in the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, and
not for all countries, right? Like Zimbabwe.
Exactly.
Zimbabwe's crisis is a bit later.
We're still, we are still in the crisis even right now. Right. So I like this. That many of the issues that you raise in this book are still prevalent in the African countries that many that we can decide to pick and talk about. And many, if not all, have learned nothing at all from the experiences of the past. And what do you think about the solution? Where does the solution really lie?
Well, I don't think I'm as pessimistic as it sounds like you are. I mean, I do think things have been, there are differences, you know. The African continent has done very well. I mean, it's been 2 pretty good decades since then. And so if you look at, you know, the dependence on aid, it's much lower than it once was. Countries, I think on average, the region aid amounted to like 15% of GDP. I think today it amounts to maybe 5% of GDP. You know, so the dependence on the donors is much lower than it used to be. There's much more private investment or non-Western investment, like Chinese investment, and that has been, on the whole, I think, good for the continent in terms of economic growth. And then I think ideologically, the continent is in a very different place. When I was interviewing, you know, decision makers in the 80s and early 90s, you know, most of them were totally against foreign direct investment. For example, they thought that was inevitably neo-colonial, and I don't think I don't think decision makers believe that anymore. Now they actually welcome foreign direct investment. So in that sense, I mean, you know, maybe ideologically you can be very wary of foreign direct investment, but it is a real change. And so economic policy is somewhat different. Now, you know, the region still has both international structural difficulties. It's you know, it's I mean, everything from European dumping in the region to relatively closed markets to it's much harder to break into export manufacturing than it was 50 years ago when say South Korea or Japan or Taiwan did it. And, you know, and then domestically, yes, I think there's still problems of governance and the like. I am a fervent believer in the power of democracy and of multi-party electoral democracy in particular. And I believe that it improves governance and, you know, the responsiveness of governments to the needs of its citizens. And I think that has changed. And so that's, for me, a cause of optimism, and I'm very much an optimist about the region. You know, I think the Africa's prospects are as good as they've ever been. I know we academic Africanists are supposed to be deeply gloomy and pessimistic, but I'm not. I think it's a period of enormous potential.
Oh, that is wonderful. That is wonderful. Professor Nicolas van der Waal, thank you very much for joining me on this talk show. Viewers and listeners, Professor Nicolas van der Waal joins me. He's a professor at Cornell University. And today we were set to discuss his book, African Economies and the Politics of Permanent Crisis. I'm going to be pasting the link to the direct access of this book, an online copy of this book that was published by Cambridge University Press in June 2012, so that you can access it. Thank you very much, Professor Nicolas van der Waal. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to have a face-to-face discussion of their outstanding publications and other top issues of the day affecting the continent and affecting individual countries in particular. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a good day.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
That is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Cheers.